Swann's Way by Marcell Proust. Since he was unable to separate himself from her without a subsequent return, if at least he had seen her continuously and without separations, his grief would ultimately have been assuaged, and his love would perhaps have died. But from the moment when she did not wish to leave Paris forever, he had hoped that she would never go. As he knew that her one prolonged absence every year was in August and September, he had abundant opportunity, several months in advance, to disassociate from it the grim picture of her absence throughout eternity, which was lodged in him by anticipation, and which, consisting of days closely akin to the days through which he was then passing, floated into a cold transparency in his mind, which it saddened and depressed, though without causing him any intolerable pain. But that conception of the future, that flowing stream, colorless and unconfined, a single word from Odette sufficed to penetrate through all Swann's defenses, and like a block of ice immobilized it, congealed its fluidity, made it freeze altogether, and Swann felt himself suddenly filled with an enormous and unbreakable mass which pressed on the inner walls of his consciousness until he was fain to burst asunder, for Odette had said casually, watching him with a malicious smile, "Forqueville is going for a fine trip at Whitsuntide. He's going to Egypt." And Swann had at once understood that this meant, "I am going to Egypt at Whitsuntide with Forqueville." And in fact, if a few days later Swann began, "About that trip that you told me you were going to take with Forqueville," she would answer carelessly, "Yes, my dear boy, we're starting on the 19th. We'll send you a view of the pyramids." Then he was determined to know whether she was Forqueville's mistress, to ask her point blank, to insist upon her telling him. He knew that there were some perjuries which, being so superstitious, she would not commit, and besides, the fear, which had hitherto restrained his curiosity of making Odette angry if he questioned her, of making himself odious, had ceased to exist now that he had lost all hope of ever being loved by her. One day he received an anonymous letter, which told him that Odette had been the mistress of countless men, several of whom it named, among them Forqueville, Monsieur de Breuil, and the painter, and women, and that she frequented houses of ill fame. He was tormented by the discovery that there was to be numbered among his friends a creature capable of sending him such a letter, for certain details betrayed in the writer a familiarity with his private life. He wondered who it could be, but he had never had any suspicion with regard to the unknown actions of other people, those which had no visible connection with what they said. And when he wanted to know whether it was rather beneath the apparent character of Monsieur de Carlos, or of Monsieur de Slams, or of Monsieur de Orsan, that he must place the untraveled region in which this ignoble action might have had its birth, as none of these men had ever, in conversation with Swann, suggested that he approved of anonymous letters, and as everything that they had ever said to him implied that they strongly disapproved, he saw no further reason for associating this infamy with the character of any one of them more than with the rest. Monsieur de Carlos was somewhat inclined to eccentricity, but he was fundamentally good and kind. Monsieur de Slams was a trifle dry, but wholesome and straight. As for Monsieur de Orsan, Swann had never met anyone who, even in the most depressing circumstances, would come to him with a more heartfelt utterance, would act more properly or with more discretion, so much so that he was unable to understand the rather indelicate part commonly attributed to Monsieur de Orsan in his relations with a certain wealthy woman, and that he was obliged to set that evil reputation on one side as irreconcilable with so many unmistakable proofs of his genuine sincerity and refinement. For a moment, Swann felt that his mind was becoming clouded. He had thought of something else so as to recover a little light until he had the courage to return to those other reflections. But then, after not having been able to suspect anyone, he was forced to suspect everyone that he knew. After all, Monsieur de Carlis might be most fond of him, might be most good-natured, but he was a neuropath. Tomorrow, perhaps he would burst into tears at hearing that Swann was ill. Today, from jealousy or in anger or carried away by some sudden idea, he might have wished to do him a deliberate injury. Really, that kind of man was the worst of all. The Prince de Slams was certainly far less devoted to Swann than was Monsieur de Carlis, but for that very reason he had not the same susceptibility with regard to him, and besides, his was a nature which, though no doubt it was cold, was as incapable of a base as of a magnanimous action. Swann regretted that he had formed no attachments in his life except to such people. Then he reflected that what prevents men from doing harm to their neighbors is fellow-feeling, that he could not, in the last resort, answer for any but men whose natures were analogous to his own. As with, so far as the heart went, that of Monsieur de Carlis, the mere thought of causing Swann so much distress would have been revolting to him. But with a man who was insensible of another order of humanity, as was the Prince de Slams, how was one to foresee the actions to which he might be led by the promptings of a different nature? To have a good heart was everything. Monsieur de Carlis had one, but Monsieur d'Orsan was not lacking in that either, and his relations with Swann, cordial but scarcely intimate, arising from the pleasure which, as they held the same views about everything they found in talking together, were more quiescent than the enthusiastic affection of Monsieur de Carlis, who was apt to be led into passionate activity, good or evil. If there was anyone by whom Swann felt that he had always been understood and, with delicacy, loved, it was Monsieur d'Orsan. Yes, but the life he led could hardly be called honorable. Swann regretted that he had never taken any notice of those rumors, that he himself had admitted jestingly that he had never felt so keen a sense of sympathy or of respect as when he was in thoroughly detrimental society. It is not for nothing, he now assured himself, that when people pass judgment upon their neighbor, their finding is based upon his actions. It is those alone that are significant, and not at all what we say or what we think. Carlis and de Slams may have this or that fault, but they are men of honor. Orsan, perhaps, has not the same faults, but he's not a man of honor. He may have acted dishonorably once again. Then he suspected Remy, who, it was true, could only have inspired the letter, but he now felt himself for a moment to be on the right track. To begin with, Loredan had his own reasons for wishing harm to Odette, and then how were we not to suppose that our servants, living in a situation inferior to our own, adding to our fortunes and to our frailties imaginary riches and vices for which they at once envied and despised us, should not find themselves led by fate to act in a manner abhorrent to people of our own class? He also suspected my grandfather. On every occasion when Swann had asked him to do him any service, had he not invariably declined? Besides, with his ideas of middle-class respectability, he might have thought that he was acting for Swann's good. He suspected in turn Bergot, the painter. The Verdunes paused for a moment to admire him. Once again, the wisdom of people in society. He refused to mix in Bergot, the painter. The Verdunes paused for a moment to admire once again the wisdom of people in society who refused to mix in the artistic circles in which such things were possible were perhaps even openly avowed as excellent jokes. But then he recalled the marks of honesty that were to be observed in those bohemians, and contrasted them with the life of expedience, often bordering on fraudulence, to which the want of money, the craving for luxury, the corrupting influence of their pleasures often drove members of the aristocracy. In a word, this anonymous letter proved that he himself knew a human being capable of the most infamous conduct. But he could see no reason why that infamy should lurk in the depths, which no strange eye might explore, of the warm heart rather than the cold, the artists rather than the businessmans, the nobles rather than the flunkies. What criterion ought one to adopt in order to judge one's fellows? After all, there was not a single one of the people whom he knew who might not, in certain circumstances, have proven capable of shameful action. Must he then cease to see them all? His mind grew clouded. He passed his hands 2 or 3 times across his brow, wiped his glasses with his handkerchief, and remembering that after all men who were as good as himself frequented the society of M. de Carlos, the Prince de Salams, and the rest, he persuaded himself that this meant, if not that they weren't capable of shameful actions, at least that it was a necessity in human life to which everyone submits, to frequent the society of people who were perhaps not incapable of such actions. And he continued to shake hands with all the friends whom he had suspected, with the purely formal reservation that each one of them had possibly been seeking to drive him to despair. As for the actual contents of the letter, they did not disturb him, for in not one of the charges which it formulated against Odette could he see the least vestige of fact. Like many other men, Swann led a naturally lazy mind, and was slow in invention. Quite well as a general truth that human life is full of contrast, but in the case of any one human being, he imagined all that part of his or her life with which he was not familiar as being identical with the part with which he was. He imagined what was kept secret from him in the light of what was revealed. At such times as he spent with Odette, if their conversation turned upon an indelicate act committed or an indelicate sentiment expressed by some third person, she would ruthlessly condemn the culprit by virtue of the same moral principles which Swann had always heard expressed by his own parents, and to which he himself had remained loyal, and then she would arrange her flowers, would sip her tea, would show an interest in his work. So Swann extended those habits to fill the rest of her life. He reconstructed those actions when he wished to form a picture of the moments in which he and she were apart. If anyone had portrayed her to him as she was, or rather as she had been for so long with himself, but had substituted some other man, he would have been distressed. For such a portrait would have struck him as lifelike, but to suppose that she went to bad houses, that she abandoned herself to orgies with other women, that she led the crapulous existence of the most abject, the most contemptible of mortals, would be an insane wandering of the mind, for the realization of which, thank heavens, the chrysanthemums that he could imagine, the daily cups of tea, the virtuous indignation, left neither time nor place. Only now and again he gave Odette to understand that people maliciously kept him informed of everything that she did, and making opportune use of some detail, insignificant but true, which he had accidentally learned, as though it were the sole fragment which he would allow, in spite of himself, to pass his lips out of the numberless other fragments of that complete reconstruction of her daily life which he carried secretly in his mind. He led her to suppose that he was perfectly informed upon matters which in reality he neither knew nor suspected, for if he often adjured Odette never to swerve from or make alteration of the truth. That was only whether he realized it or not, in order that Odette should tell him everything that she did. No doubt, as he used to assure Odette, he loved sincerity, but only as he might love a pander who could keep him in touch with the daily life of his mistress. Moreover, his love of sincerity, not being disinterested, had not improved his character. The truth which he cherished was that which Odette would tell him, but he himself, in order to extract that truth from her, was not afraid to have recourse to falsehood, that very falsehood which he never ceased to depict to Odette as leading every human creature down to utter degradation. In a word, he lied as much as did Odette, because, while more unhappy than she, he was no less egotistical. And she, when she heard him repeating thus to her the things that she had done, would stare at him with a look of distrust and, at all hazards, of indignation, so as not to appear to be humiliated and to be blushing for her actions. One day, after the longest period of calm through which he had yet been able to exist without being overtaken by an attack of jealousy, he had accepted an invitation to spend the evening at the theatre with the Princess de Slums. Having opened his newspaper to find out what was being played, the sight of the title, Les Filles de Marbre, by Theodore Barrière, struck him so cruel a blow that he recoiled instinctively from it, and turned his head away, illuminated as though by a row of footlights in the new surroundings in which now appeared that word marble, which he had lost the power to distinguish so often had it passed in print beneath his eyes, had suddenly become visible once again, and had at once brought back to his mind the story which Odette had told him long ago of a visit which she had paid to the salon at the Palais d'Industrie with Madame Verdun, who had said to her, "Take care now. I know how to melt you all right. You're not made of marble." Odette had reassured him that it was only a joke, and he had not attached any importance to it at the time, but he had had more confidence in her then than he had now, and the anonymous letter referred explicitly to relations of that sort. Without daring to lift his eyes to the newspaper, he opened it, turned the page so as not to see again the words Place de Marbre, and began to read mechanically the news from the provinces. There had been a storm in the Channel, and damage was reported from Dieppe, Calburn, Vezeval. Suddenly he recoiled again in horror. The name of Vezeval had suggested to him another place in the same district, Boiseville, which carried also, bound to it by a hyphen, a second name, to it, Brit, which he had often seen on maps, but without ever previously remarking that it was the same name as that borne by his friend, Monsieur de Brit, whom the anonymous letter accused of having been Odette's lover. After all, when it came to Monsieur de Brit, there was nothing improbable in the charge, but so far as Madame Verdun was concerned, it was a sheer impossibility. From the fact that Odette did occasionally tell a lie, it was not fair to conclude that she never by any chance told the truth. In these bantering conversations with Madame Verdun, which she herself had repeated to Swann, he could recognize those meaningless and dangerous pleasantries which, in their inexperience of life and ignorance of vice, women often utter, thereby certifying their own innocence, who, as, for instance, Odette, would be the last people in the world to feel any undue affection for one another. Whereas, on the other hand, the indignation with which she had scattered the suspicions which she had unintentionally brought into being for a moment in his mind by her story, fitted with everything that he knew of the tastes, the temperaments of his mistress. But at that moment, by an inspiration of jealousy, analogous to the inspiration which reveals to a poet or a philosopher who has nothing, so far, but an odd pair of rhymes or a detached observation, The idea of the natural law which will give power, mastery to his work, Swann recalled for the first time a remark which Odette had made to him at least 2 years before. "Oh, Madame Verdurne, she won't hear of anything just now but me. I'm a love, if you please, and she kisses me, and wants me to go with her everywhere and call her by her Christian name." So far from seeing in these expressions any connection with the absurd insinuations intended to create an atmosphere of vice, which Odette had since repeated to him, he had welcomed them as proof of Madame Verdurne's warm-hearted and generous friendship. But now this old memory of her affection for Odette had coalesced suddenly with his more recent memory of her unseemly conversation. He could not separate them in his mind, and he saw them blended in reality, and the affection imparting a certain seriousness and importance to the pleasantries which, in return, spoiled the affection of its innocence. He went to see Odette. He sat down, keeping at a distance from her. He did not care to embrace her, not knowing whether in her and himself it would be an affection or anger that a kiss would provoke. He sat there silent, watching their love expire. Suddenly he made up his mind. "Odette, my darling," he began, "I know I am being simply odious, but I must ask you a few questions. You remember what I once thought about you and Madame Verdurne? Tell me, was it true? Have you, with her or anyone else, ever?" She shook her head, pursing her lips together, a sign which people commonly employ to signify that they are not going, because it would bore them to go when someone has asked, "Are you coming to watch the procession go by, or will you be at the review?" But this shake, which is thus commonly used to decline participation in an event that has yet to come, imparts for that reason an element of uncertainty to the denial of participation in an event that is past. Furthermore, it suggests persons of personal convenience rather than of any definite repudiation, any moral impossibility. When he saw Odette thus make him a sign that the insinuation was false, he realized that it was quite possibly true. "I have told you I never did, you know quite well," she added, seeming angry and uncomfortable. "Yes, I know all that, but are you quite sure? Don't say to me you know quite well. Say, I've never done anything of that sort with any woman." She repeated his words like a lesson learned by rote, and he thought she hoped thereby to get rid of him. "I have never done anything of that sort with any woman." "Can you swear it to me on your Loretto medal?" Swann knew that Odette would never perjure herself on that. "Oh, you do make me miserable," she cried with a jerk of her body, as though to shake herself free of the constraint of his question. "Have you nearly done? What is the matter with you today? You seem to have made up your mind that I'm to be forced to hate you, to curse you. Look, I was anxious to be friends with you again and for us to have a nice time together like the old days, and this is all thanks I get." However, he would not let her go. He sat there like a surgeon who waits for spasm to subside that has interrupted his operation, but need not make him abandon it. "You are quite wrong in supposing that I bear you the least ill will in the world, Odette," he began with a persuasive and deceitful gentleness. "I never speak to you except of what I already know, and I always know a great deal more than I say, but you alone can mollify by your confession what makes me hate you so long as it has been reported to me only by other people. My anger with you is never due to your actions. I can and do forgive you everything because I love you, but to your untruthfulness, the ridiculous untruthfulness which makes you persist in denying things which I know to be true, how can you expect that I shall continue to love you when I see you swear to me a thing which I know to be false? Odette, do not prolong this moment which is torturing us both. If you are willing to end it at once, you shall be free of it forever. Tell me, upon your medal, yes or no, whether you have ever done those things." "How on earth can I tell?" She was furious. "Perhaps I have, ever so long ago, when I didn't know what I was doing. Perhaps 2 or 3 times. Swann had prepared himself for all possibilities. Reality must, therefore, be something which bears no relation to possibilities, any more than a stab of a knife in one's body bears to the gradual movement
of the clouds overhead, since the words 2 or 3 times carved, as it were, a cross upon the living tissues of his heart. A strange thing indeed that those words, 2 or 3 times, nothing more than a few words uttered in the air at a distance, could so lacerate a man's heart as if they had actually pierced it, could sicken a man like a poison that he had drunk. Instinctively, Swann thought of the remark that he had heard at Madame de Saint Aveurt's. "I have never seen anything to beat it since the table-turning." The agony that he now suffered in no way resembled what he had supposed, not only because in the hours when he most entirely mistrusted her he had rarely imagined such a culmination of evil, but because even when he did not imagine that offense, it remained vague, uncertain, was not clothed in the particular horror which had escaped with the words perhaps 2 or 3 times, was not armed with that specific cruelty, as different from anything that he had known as a new malady by which one is attacked for the first time. And yet this Odette, from whom all this evil sprang, was no less dear to him, was, on the contrary, more precious, as if in proportion as his sufferings increased, there increased at the same time the price of the sedative, of the antidote, which this woman alone possessed. He wished to pay her more attention as one attends to disease which one discovers suddenly to have grown more serious. He wished that the horrible thing which she had told him she had done 2 or 3 times might be prevented from ever occurring again. To ensure that, he must watch over Odette. People often say that by pointing out to a man the faults of his mistress, you succeed only in strengthening his attachment to her. But he does not believe you, yet how much more so if he does. But Swann asked how could he manage to protect her? He might perhaps be able to preserve her from the contamination of any one woman, but there were hundreds of other women, and he realized how insane had been his ambition when he had begun on the evening when he had failed to find Odette at the Verdurins to desire the possession, as if that were ever possible, of another person. Happily for Swann, beneath the mass of suffering which had invaded his soul like a conquering horde of barbarians, there lay a natural foundation, older and more placid, and silently laborious, like the cells of an injured organ, which had once set to work to repair the damaged tissue, or the muscles of a paralyzed limb, which tend to recover their former movements. These old indwellers in his soul absorbed all Swann's strength for a while in that obscure task of reparation which gives one an illusory sense of repose during convalescence or after an operation. This time it was not so much, as it ordinarily was, in Swann's brain that the slackening of tension due to exhaustion took effect. It was rather in his heart. But all the things in life that have once existed tend to recur, and like a dying animal that is once more stirred by the throes of a convulsion which was apparently ended, upon Swann's heart, spared for a moment only, the same agony returned of its own accord to trace the same cross again. He remembered those moonlit evenings when, leaning back in the Victoria that was taking him to the Rue La Paroisse, he would cultivate with voluptuous enjoyment the emotions of a man in love, ignorant of the poisoned fruit that such emotions must inevitably bear. But all those thoughts lasted for no more than a second. At the time that it took him to raise his hand to his heart, to draw breath again and to contrive to smile, so as to dissemble his torment, already he had begun to put further questions, for his jealousy, which had taken an amount of trouble, such as no enemy would have incurred, to strike him this mortal blow, to make him forcibly acquainted with the most cruel pain that he had ever known, his jealousy was not satisfied that he had yet suffered enough, and sought to expose his bosom to an even deeper wound. Like an evil deity, his jealousy was inspiring Swann, was thrusting him on towards destruction. It was not his fault, but Odette's alone, if at first his punishment was not more severe. "My darling," he began, "it's all over now. Was it with anyone I know?" "No, I swear it wasn't. Besides, I think I exaggerated. I never really went as far as that." He smiled and resumed with, Just as you like. It doesn't really matter, but it's unfortunate that you can't give me any names. If I were able to form an idea of the person, that would prevent my ever thinking of her again. I say it for your own sake, because then I shouldn't bother you any more about it. It's so soothing to be able to form a clear picture of things in one's mind. What is really terrible is what one cannot imagine. But you've been so sweet to me. I don't want to tire you. I do thank you with all my heart for all the good that you have done me. I've quite finished now. Only one more word. How many times?
Oh, Charles, can't you see you're killing me? And it's all ever so long ago. I've never given it a thought. Anyone would say that you were positively trying to put those ideas into my head again. And then you'd be a lot better off, she concluded, with unconscious stupidity, but with intentional malice. I only wish to know whether it had been since I knew you. It's only natural. Did it happen here ever? You can't give me any particular evening so that I can remind myself what I was doing at the time? You understand surely that it's not possible that you don't remember with whom, Odette, my love. But I don't know, really, I don't. I think it was in the boys. One evening when you came to meet us on the island, you had been dining with the Princess de Lams, she added, happy to be able to furnish him with an exact detail, which testified to her veracity. At the next table there was a woman whom I hadn't seen for ever so long. She said to me, "Come along round behind the rock there and look at the moonlight on the water." At first I just yawned and said, "No, I'm too tired, and I'm quite happy where I am, thank you." She swore there'd never be anything like it again in that way of moonlight. "I've heard that tale before," I said to her. "You see, I knew quite well what she was after." Odette narrated this episode almost as if it were a joke, either because it appeared to her to be quite natural, or because she thought that she was thereby minimizing its importance, or else so as not to appear ashamed. But, catching sight of Swann's face, she changed her tone, and, "You're a fiend," she flung at him. "You enjoy tormenting me, making me tell you lies, just so that you'll leave me in peace." The second blow struck at Swann was even more excruciating than the first. Never had he supposed it to have been so recent an affair, hidden from his eyes that had been too innocent to discern it, not in a past which he had ever known, but in evenings which he so well remembered, which he had lived through with Odette, of which he had supposed himself to have such an intimate, such an exhaustive knowledge, and which now assumed retrospectively an aspect of cunning and deceit and cruelty. In the midst of them parted suddenly a gaping chasm. That moment on the island and the boy alone. Without being intelligent, Odette had the charm of being natural. She had acted the little scene with so much simplicity that Swann, as he gasped for breath, could vividly see it. The rock, Odette yawning. He could hear her answer, "Alas, how light-heartedly! I've heard that tale before." He felt that she would tell him nothing more that evening, that no further revelation was to be expected for the present. He was silent for a time, then he said to her, "My poor darling, you must forgive me. I know I am hurting you dreadfully, but it's all over now. I shall never think of it again." But she saw that his eyes remained fixed upon the things that he did not know, and on the past era of their love, monotonous and soothing in his memory, because it was vague and now rent as with a sword wound. But the news of that minute on the island of the boys, by moonlight, while he was dining with the Princess de Lams, but he had so far acquired the habit of finding life interesting, of marveling at the strange discoveries that there were to be made in it, that even while he was suffering so acutely that he did not believe it possible to endure such agony for any length of time, he was saying to himself,
Life is indeed astonishing, and holds some fine surprises. It appears that vice is far more common than one has been led to believe. Here is a woman in whom I had absolute confidence, who looks so simple, so honest, who, in any case, even allowing that her morals are not strict, seemed quite normal and healthy in her tastes and inclinations. I receive a most improbable accusation. I question her, and the little that she admits reveals far more than I could ever have suspected. But he could not confine himself to these detached observations. He sought to form an exact estimate of the importance of what she had just told him, so as to know whether he might conclude that she had done these things often and was likely to do them again. He repeated her words to himself. I knew quite well what she was after. 2 or 3 times I've heard that tale before, and they did not reappear in his memory unarmed. Each of them held a knife with which it stabbed him afresh. For a long time, like a sick man who cannot restrain himself from attempting every minute to make the movement that he knows will hurt him, he kept on murmuring to himself, I'm quite happy where I am, thank you. I've heard that tale before. But the pain was so intense that he was obliged to stop. He was amazed to find that these actions, which he had always hitherto judged so lightly, had dismissed indeed with a laugh, should have become as serious to him as a disease, which might easily prove fatal. He knew any number of women whom he could ask to keep an eye on Odette. But how was he to expect them to adjust themselves to his new point of view, and not to remain at that time, which for so long had been his own, which had always guided him in his voluptuous experience, not to say to him with a smile, You jealous monster, wanting to rob other people of their pleasure? By what trap door, suddenly lowered, had he, who had never found in the old days in his love for Odette any but the most refined of pleasures, been precipitated into this new circle of hell from which he could not see how he was ever to escape? Poor Odette! He wished her no harm, but was half to blame. Had he not been told that it was her own mother who had sold her, when she was still little more than a child, at Nice, to a wealthy Englishman? But what an agonizing truth was now contained for him in those lines of Alfred de Vigny's Journal d'un Poète, which he had previously read without emotion. When one feels oneself smitten by love for a woman, one ought to say to oneself, what are her surroundings? What has been her life? All one's future happiness lies in the answer. Swann was astonished that such simple phrases, spelt over in his mind as, I've heard that tale before, or I knew quite well what she was after, could cause him so much pain. But he realized that what he had mistaken for simple phrases were indeed parts of the panoply, which held and could inflict on him the anguish that he had felt while Odette was telling her story. For it was the same anguish that he now was feeling afresh. It was no good, his knowing now. Indeed, it was no good, as time went on, his having partly forgotten and altogether forgiven the offense. Whenever he repeated her words, his old anguish refashioned him as he had been before Odette began to speak. Ignorant, trustful, his merciless jealousy placed him once again so that he might be effectively wounded by Odette's admission, in the position of a man who does not yet know the truth. And after several months, this old story would still dumbfounder him like a sudden revelation. He marveled at the terrible recreative power of his memory, It was only by the weakening of that generative force whose fecundity diminishes as age creeps over one that he could hope for a relaxation of his torments. But as soon as the power that any one of Odette's sentences had to make Swann suffer seemed to be nearly exhausted, lo, and behold another, one of those to which he had hitherto paid least attention, almost a new sentence, came to relieve the first, and to strike at him with undiminished force. The memory of the evening on which he had dined with the Princess de Lams was painful to him, but it was no more than the center, the core of his pain, that radiated vaguely round about him, overflowing into all the preceding and following days. And on whatever point in it he might intend his memory to rest, it was the whole of that season during which the Verdurns had so often gone to dine upon the island and the boys that sprang back to hurt him so violently that by slow degrees the curiosity which his jealousy was ever exciting in him was neutralized by his fear of the fresh tortures which he would be inflicting upon himself were he to satisfy it. He recognized that all the period of Odette's life which had elapsed before she first met him, a period of which he had never sought to form any picture in his head, was not the featureless abstraction which he could vaguely see, but had consisted of so many definite, dated years, each crowded with concrete incidents. But were he to learn more of them, he feared lest her past, now colorless, fluid, and supportable, might assume a tangible and obscene form with individual and diabolical features. And he continued to refrain from seeking a conception of it, not any longer now from laziness of mind, but from fear of suffering. He hoped that some day he might be able to hear the island and the boy of the Princess de Lams mentioned without feeling any twinge of that old rending pain. Meanwhile, he thought it imprudent to provoke Odette into furnishing him with French sentences, with the names of more places, people, and of different events, which, when his malady was still scarcely healed, would make it break out again in another form. But often enough, the things that he did not know, that he dreaded now to learn, it was Odette herself who, spontaneously and without thought of what she did, revealed them to him, for the gap which her vices made between her actual life and the comparatively innocent life which Swann had believed, and often still believed his mistress to lead, was far wider than she knew. A vicious person, always affecting the same air of virtue before people whom he is anxious to keep from having any suspicion of his vices, has no register, no gauge at hand from which he may ascertain how far those vices, their continuous growth being imperceptible by himself, have gradually segregated him from the normal ways of life. In the course of their cohabitation, in Odette's mind, with the memory of those of her actions which she concealed from Swann, her innocuous actions were gradually colored, infected by these, without her being able to detect anything strange in them, without their causing any explosion in the particular region of herself in which she made them live. But when she related them to Swann, he was overwhelmed by the revelation of the duplicity to which they pointed. One day he was trying, without hurting Odette, to discover from her whether she had ever had any dealings with procuresses. He was, as a matter of fact, convinced that she had not. The anonymous letter had put the idea into his head, but in a purely mechanical way. It had received there with no credulity, but it had, for all that, remained there, and Swann, wishing to be rid of the burden, a dead weight, but none the less disturbing, of these suspicions, hoped that Odette would now extirpate it forever. Oh dear no, not that they don't simply persecute me to go to them. Her smile revealed a gratified vanity which she no longer saw that it was impossible should appear legitimate to Swann. There was one of them waited more than 2 hours for me yesterday, said she. Would not give me any money I asked. It seems there's an ambassador who said to her, I'll kill myself if you don't bring her to me. Meaning me. They told her I'd gone out, but she waited and waited, and in the end I had to go myself and speak to her before she'd go away. I do wish you could have seen the way I tackled her. My maid was in the next room, listening, and told me I should shout a fit to bring the house down, but when you hear me say that I don't want to, the idea of such a thing, I don't like it at all. I should hope I'm still free to do as I please, and when I please and where I please. If I needed the money, I could understand. The porter has orders not to let her in again. He will tell her that I'm out of town. Oh, I do wish I could have had you hidden somewhere in the room while I was talking to her. I know you'd have been pleased, my dear. There's some good in your little Odette, you see, after all, though people do say such dreadful things about her. Besides her very admissions, when she made any, of faults which she supposed him to have discovered, rather served Swann as a starting point for fresh doubts than they put an end to the old, for her admissions never exactly coincided with his doubts. In vain might Odette expurgate her confession of all its essential part. There would remain in the accessories something which Swann had never yet imagined. Something crushed him anew, and was to enable him to alter the terms of the problem of his jealousy, and these admissions he could never forget. His spirit carried them along, cast them aside, then cradled them again in his bosom, like corpses in a river, and they poisoned it. She spoke to him once of a visit that Forval had paid her on the day of the Paris Merci fête. What? You knew him as long ago as that? Oh, yes, of course you did, he corrected himself, so as not to shew that he had been ignorant of the fact. And suddenly he began to tremble at the thought that on the day of the Paris Merci fête, when he had received the letter which he had so carefully preserved, she had been having luncheon, perhaps, with Forval at the Maison d'Or. She swore that she had not. Still, the Maison d'Or reminds me of something or other which I knew at the time wasn't true, he pursued, hoping to frighten her. Yes, that I hadn't been there at all that evening when I told you I had just come from there, and you had been looking for me at the Prevost's, she replied, judging by his manner that he knew, with a firmness that was based not so much upon cynicism as upon timidity, a fear of crossing Swann, which her own self-respect made her anxious to conceal, and desired to show him that she could be perfectly frank if she chose, and so she struck him with all the sharpness and force of a headsman wielding his axe, and yet could not be charged with cruelty, since she was quite unconscious of hurting him. She even began to laugh, though this may, perhaps, it is true, have been chiefly to keep him from thinking that she was ashamed at all or confused. It's quite true. I hadn't been to the Maison d'Or. I was coming away from the Forvals. I'd really been to the Prevost. That wasn't a story. And he met me there and asked me to come in and look at his prints. But someone else came to see him. I told you that I was coming from the Maison d'Or because I was afraid you might be angry with me. It was rather nice of me, really, don't you see? I admit I did wrong, but at least I'm telling you about it all. Now, ain't I? what have I to gain by not telling you straight that I lunched with him on the day of the Paris Merci Fête? If it were true, especially as at that time we didn't know one another quite so well as we do now, did we, dear?" He smiled back at her with the sudden craven weakness of the utterly spiritless creature which these crushing words had made of him. Even so, even in the months of which he had never dared to think again, because they had been too happy, in those months when she had loved him, she was already lying to him. Besides that moment, the first evening on which they had done a catelia, when she had told him that she was coming home from Maison d'Or, how many others must there have been, each of them covering a falsehood of which Swann had no suspicion. He recalled how she had said to him, "I need only to tell Madame Verdurne that my dress wasn't ready, or that my cab came late. There's always some excuse." From himself, too, probably, many times when she had glibly uttered such words as explain a delay or justify an alteration of the hour fixed for a meeting, those moments must have hidden, without his having the least inkling of it at that time, an engagement that she had had with some other man, some man to whom she had said, "I need only to tell Swann that my dress wasn't ready, or that my cab came late. There's always some excuse." And beneath all his most pleasant memories, beneath the simplest words that Odette had ever spoken to him in those old days, words which he had believed as though they were the words of a gospel, beneath her daily actions which she had recounted to him, beneath the most ordinary places, her dressmaker's flat, the Avenue du Bois, the Hippodrome, he could feel, dissembled there by virtue of that temporal superfluidity which, after the most detailed account of how a day has been spent, always leaves something over, that may serve as a hiding place for certain unconfessed actions. He could feel the insinuation of a possible undercurrent of falsehood which debased for him all that had remained most precious, his happiest evenings, the Rue La Perrose itself, which Odette must constantly have been leaving at other hours than those of which she told him, extending the power of the dark horror that had gripped him when he had heard her admission with regard to the Maison d'Or, and like the obscene creatures in the desolation of Nineveh, shattering stone by stone the whole edifice of his past. If now he had turned aside whenever his memory repeated the cruel name of the Maison d'Or, it was because that name recalled to him no longer as such a little time since at Madame de Saint-Auvert's party the good fortune which he long had lost, but a misfortune of which he was now first aware. Then it befell the Maison d'Or, as it had befallen the island and the boy, that gradually its name ceased to trouble him. For what we suppose to be our love, our jealousies are neither of them single, continuous, and individual passions. They are composed of an infinity of successive loves, of different jealousies, each of which is ephemeral, although by the uninterrupted multitude they give us the impression of continuity, the illusion of unity. The life of Swann's love, the fidelity of his jealousy, were formed out of death, of infidelity, of innumerable desires, innumerable doubts, all of which had Odette for their object. If he had remained for any length of time without seeing her, those that died would not have been replaced by others, but the presence of Odette continued to sow in Swann's heart alternate seeds of love and suspicion. On certain evenings she would suddenly resume towards him a kindness of which she would warn him sternly that he must not take immediate advantage, under penalty of not seeing it repeated for years to come. He must instantly accompany her home to do a catelia, and the desire which she pretended to have for him was so sudden, so inexplicable, so imperious. The kisses which she lavished on him were so demonstrative and so unfamiliar that this brutal and unnatural fondness made Swann just as unhappy as any lie or unkind action. One evening, when he had thus, in obedience to her command, gone home with her, and while she was interspersing her kisses with passionate words in strained contrast to her habitual coldness, he thought suddenly that he heard a sound. He rose, searched everywhere, and found nobody. But he had not the courage to return to his place by her side, whereupon she, in a towering rage, broke a vase with, "I never can do anything right with you, you impossible person," and he was left uncertain whether she had not actually had some man concealed in the room whose jealousy she had wished to wound, or else to inflame his senses. Sometimes he repaired to gay houses, hoping to learn something about Odette, although he dared not mention her name. "I have a little thing here you're sure to like," the manageress would greet him, and he would stay for an hour or so talking dolefully to some poor girl who sat there astonished that he went no further. One of them, who was still quite young and attractive, said to him once, "Of course what I should want would be to find a real friend, that he might be quite certain I should never go with any other man again." Indeed, you think it possible for a woman really to be touched by a man's being in love with her, and never to be unfaithful to him? Asked Swann anxiously. "Why, surely, it all depends on their characters." Swann could not help making the same remarks to these girls as would have delighted the Princess d'Islam. To the one who was in search of a friend, he said, with a smile, "But how nice of you. You've put on blue eyes to go with your sash. And you, too, you've got blue cuffs on. What a charming conversation we are having for a place of this sort. I'm not boring you, am I, or keeping you? No, I've nothing to do, thank you. If you bored me, I should say so, but I love hearing you talk. I am highly flattered. Aren't we behaving prettily?" he asked the manageress, who had just looked in. "Why, yes, that's just what I was saying to myself. How sensibly they're behaving. But that's how it is. People come to my house now just to talk. The prince was telling me only the other day that he's far more comfortable here than with his wife. It seems that nowadays all the society ladies are here. A perfect scandal, I call it. But I'll leave you in peace now. I know when I'm not wanted." She ended discreetly and left Swann with the girl who had the blue eyes. But presently he rose and said good-bye to her. She had ceased to interest him. She did not know Odette. The painter having been ill, Dr. Cotter recommended a sea voyage. Several of the faithful spoke of accompanying him. The Verdurins could not face the prospect of being left alone in a cruise in Paris, so first of all hired and finally purchased a yacht. Thus Odette was constantly going on a cruise. Whenever she had been away for any length of time, Swann would feel that he was beginning to detach himself from her, but as though his moral distance was proportionate to the physical distance between them, whenever he heard that Odette had returned to Paris, he could not rest without seeing her. Once, when they had gone away, as everyone thought, for a month only, either they succumbed to a series of temptations, or else Mr. Verdun had cunningly arranged everything beforehand to please his wife, and disclosed his plans to the faithful only as time went on. Anyhow, from Algiers they flitted to Tunis, then to Italy, Greece, Constantinople, Asia Minor. They had been absent for nearly a year, and Swann felt perfectly at ease and almost happy, albeit Mr. Verne had endeavored to persuade the pianist and Dr. Cotter that their respective aunts and patients had no need of them, and that in any event it was most rash to allow Madame Cottard to return to Paris, where Madame Verdun assured him a revolution had just broken out. He was obliged to grant them their liberty at Constantinople, and the painter came home with them. One day, shortly after the return of these 4 travelers, Swann, seeing an omnibus approach him, labeled Luxembourg, and having some business there, had jumped on it, had found himself sitting opposite Madame Cottard, who was paying a round of visits to people whose day it was in full review order, with a plume in her hat, a silk dress, a muff, an umbrella, which do for a parasol if the rain kept off, a card case, and a pair of white gloves fresh from the cleaners. Wearing these badges of rank, she would, in fine weather, go on foot from one house to another in the same neighborhood, but when she had to proceed to another district, would make use of a transfer ticket on the omnibus. For the first minute or two, until the natural courtesy of the woman broke through the starched surface of the doctor's wife, not being certain either whether she ought to mention the Verdurns before Swann, she produced quite naturally in her slow and awkward but not unattractive voice, which every now and then was completely drowned out by the rattling of the omnibus, topics selected from those which she had picked up and would repeat in each of the score of houses up the stairs of which she clambered in the course of an afternoon. I needn't ask you, Mr. Swann, whether a man so much in the movement as yourself has been to the Mirletons to see the portrait by Macquart, that the whole of Paris is running after him. Well, and what do you think of it? Whose champ are you? It's the same in every house in Paris now. No one will speak of anything else but Macquart's portrait. You aren't smart, you aren't really cultured, you aren't up to date unless you give an opinion on Macquart's portrait. Swann having replied that he had not seen this portrait, Madame Cottard was afraid that she might have hurt his feelings by obliging him to confess the omission. Oh, that's quite all right. At least you have the courage to be quite frank about it. You didn't consider yourself disgraced because you haven't seen Macquart's portrait. I do think that so nice of you. Well, now, I have seen it. Opinion is divided, you know. There are some people who find it rather labored, like whipped cream, they say. But I think it's just ideal. Of course, it's not a bit like the blue and yellow ladies that our friend Bick paints. That's quite clear. But I must tell you perfectly frankly, you'll think me dreadfully old-fashioned, but I always say just what I think, that I don't understand his work. I can quite see the good points that are in his portrait of my husband. Oh, dear me, yes, and it's certainly less odd than most of what he does, but even then he had to give the poor man a blue mustache. But Macquart, just listen to this now. The friend of my husband, I am on my way to see at this very moment, which has given me the very great pleasure of your company, has promised her that, if he is elected to the Academy, he is one of the doctor's colleagues, he will get Macquart to paint her portrait. So she's got something to look forward to. I have another friend who insists that she'd rather have Lelore. I'm only a wretched Philistine, and I've no doubt Lelore has perhaps more knowledge of painting even than Macquart, but I do think that the most important thing about a portrait, especially when it's going to cost 10,000 francs, is that it should be like a pleasant likeness, if you know what I mean. Having exhausted this topic, to which she had been inspired by the loftiness of her plume, the monogram on her card case, the little numbered ink inside each of the gloves by the cleaner, and the difficulty of speaking to Swann about the Verdurns, Madame Cottard, seeing that they still had a long way to go before they would reach the corner of the Rue Bonaparte, where the conductor was to set her down, listened to the promptings of her heart, which counseled other words than these. Your ears must have been burning, she ventured. While we were on the yacht with Madame Verdurn, we were talking about you all the time. Swann was genuinely astonished, for he supposed that his name was never uttered in the Verdurins' presence. You see, Madame Cottard went on, Madame Ducray was there. Need I say more? When Odette is anywhere, it's never long before she begins talking about you, and you know quite well it isn't nasty things she says. What? You don't believe me? She went on, noticing that Swann looked skeptical and carried away by the sincerity of her conviction without putting any evil meaning into the word, which she used purely in the sense in which one employs it to speak of affection that unites a pair of friends. Why, she adores you. No, indeed, I'm sure it would never do to say anything against you when she was about. One would soon be taught one's place. Whatever we might be doing, if we were looking at a picture, for instance, she would say, if only we had him here. He's the man who could tell us whether it's genuine or not. There's no one like him for that. And all day long she would be saying, what can he be doing now? I do hope he's doing a little work. It's too dreadful that a fellow with such gifts has to be so lazy. Forgive me, won't you? I can see him this very moment. He's thinking of us. He's wondering where we are. Indeed, she used an expression which I thought very pretty at the time. Mr. Verdun asked her, how in the world can you see what he's doing? He's 1,000 miles away. And Odette answered, nothing is impossible to the eye of a friend.
No, I assure you, I'm not saying it just to flatter you. You have a true friend in her, such as one doesn't find often. I can tell you besides, in case you don't know it, you're the only one. Madame Verdun told me as much herself on our last day with them. One talks more freely, don't you know, before parting. I don't say that Odette isn't fond of us, but anything that we may say to her counts for very little beside what Swann might say. Oh, mercy, there's the conductor stopping for me. Here have I been chatting away to you, and would have gone right past the Rue Bonaparte, and never noticed. Will you be so kind as to tell me whether my plume is straight? And Madame Cottard withdrew from her muff to offer it to Swann, a white-gloved hand from which there floated in a transier ticket an atmosphere of fashionable life that pervaded the omnibus, blended with the harsher fragrance of newly cleaned kid, and Swann felt himself overflowing with gratitude toward her, as well as Madame Verdun, and almost to Odette, for the feeling that he now entertained for her was no longer tinged with pain, was scarcely even to be described now as love. While from the platform of the omnibus he followed her with loving eyes as she gallantly threaded her way along the Rue Bonaparte, her plume erect, her skirt held up in one hand, while in the other she clasped an umbrella and her card case, so that its monogram could be seen, her muff dancing in the air before her as she went, to compete with and so to stimulate the moribund feelings that Swann had for Odette. Madame Cottard, a wiser physician in this case than ever her husband would have been, had drafted among them others more normal feelings of gratitude and friendship, which in Swann's mind were to make Odette seem again more human, more like other women, since other women could inspire the same feelings in him, were to hasten her final transformation back into that Odette, loved with an undisturbed affection, who had taken him home one evening after a revel at the painter's to drink orangeade with Forgeville, that Odette with whom Swann had calculated that he might live in happiness. In former times, having often thought with terror that a day must come when he would cease to be in love with Odette, he had determined to keep a sharp lookout, and as soon as he felt that love was beginning to escape him, to cling tightly to it, and to hold it back. But now, in the faintness of his love there corresponded a simultaneous faintness in his desire to remain her lover, for a man cannot change, that is to say, become another person, while he continues to obey the dictates of the self which he has ceased to be. Occasionally the name, if it caught his eye in a newspaper of one of the men whom he supposed to have been Odette's lovers, reawakened his jealousy, but it was very slight, and inasmuch as it proved to him that he had not completely emerged from that period in which he had so keenly suffered, though in it he had also known a way of feeling so intensely happy, and that the accidents of his course might enable him to catch an occasional glimpse, stealthy and at a distance, of its beauties. Their jealousy gave him, if anything, an agreeable thrill, as to the sad Parisian when he has left Venice behind and must return to France. The last mosquito proves that Italy and summer are still not too remote, but as a rule, with this particular period of his life from which he was emerging, when he made an effort, if not to remain in it, at least to obtain, while still he might, an uninterrupted view of it, he discovered that already it was too late. He would have looked back to distinguish, as it might be a landscape that was about to disappear, that love from which he had departed, but it is so difficult to enter into a state of complete duality and to present to oneself the lifelike spectacle of a feeling which one has ceased to possess, that very soon, the clouds gathering in his brain, he could see nothing. He would abandon the attempt, would take the glasses from his nose and wipe them, and he told himself that he would do better, to rest for a little, that there would be time enough later on, and settle back into his corner with as little curiosity, with as much torpor as the drowsy traveller who pulls his cap down over his eyes so as to get some sleep in the railway carriage that is drawing him. He feels faster and faster out of the country in which he has lived for so long, and while he vowed that he would not allow to slip away from him without looking out to bid it a last farewell, indeed, like the same traveller, if he does not awake until he has crossed the frontier and is again in France, when Swann happened to alight close at hand upon something which proved that Forquevaulx had been Odette's lover, he discovered that it caused him no pain, that love was now utterly remote, and he regretted that he had had no warning of the moment in which he had emerged from it forever. And just as, before kissing Odette for the first time, he had sought to imprint upon his memory the face that for so long had been familiar, before it was altered by the additional memory of their kiss, so he could have wished, and thought at least, to have been in a position to bid farewell. While still she existed, to that Odette who had inspired love in him and jealousy, to that Odette who had caused him so to suffer, and whom now he would never see again. He was mistaken. He was destined to see her once again, a few weeks later. It was while he was asleep in the twilight of a dream. He was walking with Madame Verdun, Dr. Cottard, a young man in the fez whom he failed to identify, the painter, Odette, Napoleon III, and my grandfather, along a path which followed the line of the coast and overhung the sea, now at a great height, now by a few feet only, so that they were continually going up and down. Those of the party who had reached the downward slope were no longer visible to those who were still climbing. What little daylight yet remained was failing, and it seemed as though a black night was immediately to fall upon them. Now and then the waves dashed against the cliff, and Swann could feel on his cheek a shower of freezing spray. Odette told him to wipe this off, but he could not, and felt confused and helpless in her company, as well as because he was in his nightshirt. He hoped that in the darkness this might pass unnoticed. Madame Verdun, however, fixed her astonished gaze upon him for an endless moment, in which he saw her face change its shape, her nose grow longer, while beneath it there sprouted a heavy mustache. He turned away to examine Odette. Her cheeks were pale with little fiery spots. Her features were drawn and ringed with shadows, but she looked back at him with eyes welling with affection. ready to detach themselves like tears and to fall upon his face, and he felt that he loved her so much that he would have liked to carry her off with him at once. Suddenly Odette turned her wrist, glanced at a tiny watch, and said, "I must go." She took leave of everyone in the same formal manner, without taking Swann aside, without telling him where they were to meet that evening or next day. He dared not ask. He would have liked to follow her. He was obliged, without turning back in her direction, to answer with a smile some question by Madame Verdun, but his heart was frantically beating. He felt that he now hated Odette. He would gladly have crushed those eyes which a moment ago he had loved so dearly, have torn the blood into those lifeless cheeks. He continued to climb with Madame Verdun. That is to say that each step took him farther from Odette, who was going downhill and in the other direction. A second passed, and it was many hours since she had left him. The painter remarked to Swann that Napoleon III had eclipsed himself immediately after Odette. They had obviously arranged it between them, he added. They must have agreed to meet at the foot of the cliff, but they wouldn't say goodbye together. It might have looked odd. She is his mistress. The strange young man burst into tears. Swann endeavored to console him. "After all, she is quite right," he said to the young man, drying his eyes for him and taking off the fez to make him feel more at ease. "I've advised her to do that myself a dozen times. Why be so distressed? He was obviously the man to understand her." So Swann reasoned with himself, for the young man whom he had failed at first to identify was himself also. Like certain novelists, he had distributed his own personality between two characters, him who was the first person in the dream, and another whom he saw before him capped with a fez. As for Napoleon III, it was to Forquevaulx that some vague association of ideas, then a certain modification of the Baron's usual physiognomy, and lastly the broad ribbon of the Legion of Honor across his breast, had made Swann give him that name, but actually, and in everything that the person who appeared in his dream represented and recalled to him, was indeed Forquevaulx. For, from an incomplete and changing set of images, Swann in his sleep drew false deductions, enjoying at the same time such creative power that he was able to reproduce himself by a simple act of division, like certain lower organisms. With the warmth that he felt in his own palm, he modeled the hollow of a strange hand, which he thought that he was clasping, and out of feelings and impressions of which he was not yet conscious, he brought about sudden vicissitudes which, by a chain of logical sequences, would produce, at definite points in his dream, the person required to receive his love or to startle him awake. In an instant night grew black around him. An alarm rung. The inhabitants ran past him, escaping from their blazing houses. He could hear the thunder of the surging waves and also of his own heart, which was equal with violence, was anxiously beating in his breast. Suddenly the speed of these palpitations redoubled. He felt a pain, a nausea that were inexplicable. A peasant, dreadfully burned, flung at him as he passed, "Come," and asked Charles where Odette spent the night with her friend. He used to go about with her, and she tells him everything. It was they that started the fire. It was his valet come to awaken him and saying, "Sir, it is 8 o'clock, and the barber is here. I have told him to call again in an hour." But these words, as they dived down to the waves of sleep in which Swann was submerged, did not reach his consciousness without undergoing that refraction which turns a ray of light at the bottom of a bowl of water into another sun. Just as a moment earlier, the sound of the doorbell, swelling in the depths of his abyss of sleep to the clangor of an alarm, had engendered the episode of the fire. Meanwhile, the scenery of his dream stage scattered in dust. He opened his eyes, heard for the last time the boom of a wave, and the sea grown very distant. He touched his cheek. It was dry, and yet he could feel the sting of the cold spray and the taste of salt on his lips. He rose and dressed himself. He had made the barber come early because he had written the day before to my grandfather to say that he was going that afternoon to Cambrai, having learned that Madame de Cambremer and Monsieur Legrand was spending a few days there. The association in his memory of her young and charming face with a place in the country which he had not visited for so long offered him a combined attraction which had made him decide at last to leave Paris for a while. As the different changes and chances that bring us into the company of certain other people in this life do not coincide with the periods in which we are in love with those people, but overlapping them, may occur before love has begun, and may be repeated after love is ended. The earliest appearances in our life of a creature who is destined to afford us pleasure, later on, assume retrospectively in our eyes a certain value as an indication, a warning, a presage. It was in this fashion that Swann had often carried back his mind to the image of Odette, encountered in the theater. On that first evening when he had no thought of ever seeing her again, and that he now recalled the party at Madame de Saint-Vert's, at which he introduced General de Fougerville to Madame de Cambremer. So manifold are our interests in life that it is not uncommon that on a single occasion the foundations of a happiness which does not yet exist are laid down simultaneously with aggravations of a grief from which we are still suffering. And no doubt that might have occurred to Swann elsewhere than at Madame de Saint-Vert's, who indeed can say whether, in the event of his having gone that evening somewhere else, other happinesses or other griefs would not have come to him, which later would have appeared to have been inevitable. But what did seem to him to have been inevitable was what had indeed taken place, and he was not far short of seeing something providential in the fact that he had at last decided to go to Madame de Saint-Vert's that evening because his mind, anxious to admire the richness of invention that life shows, and incapable of facing a difficult problem for any length of time, such as to discover what actually had been most to be wished for, came to the conclusion that the sufferings through which he had passed that evening and the pleasures at that time unsuspected, which were already being brought to birth, the exact balance between which was too difficult to establish, were linked by a sort of concatenation of necessity. But while an hour after his awakening he was giving instructions to the barber so that his stiffly brushed hair should not become disarranged on the journey, he thought once again of his dream. He saw once again, as he had felt then close behind him, Odette's pallid complexion, her too thin cheeks, her drawn features, her tired eyes, all the things which, in the course of those successive bursts of affection, which had made of his enduring love for Odette a long oblivion of the first impression that he had formed of her, he had ceased to observe after the first few days of their intimacy, days to which doubtless while he slept, his memory had returned to seek the exact sensation of those things, and with that old intermittent fatuity which reappeared in him now that he was no longer unhappy, and lowered at the same time the average level of his morality, he cried out in his heart, "To think that I have wasted years of my life, that I have longed for death, that the greatest love that I have ever known has been for a woman who did not please me, who was not in my style,